Okay, so welcome to week 7 of Government 370, American Political Economy. What I want to do this week is cover 3 topics from the syllabus in 3 separate short videos. We're going to cover money and banking from the Civil War to World War I. We'll talk a little bit about trusts and markets and this whole issue of competition and monopoly and how that was handled. And also we'll talk briefly about the income tax. Now, for this first short video, we're just going to cover 3 parts of this week's topic, and that first part itself comes in 3 parts. So first, we're going to talk a bit about greenbacks, the gold standard, and all the issues of the money supply between the Civil War and the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1914. We'll talk a bit about the panics and crashes that are linked to all that, and the rise of populism and the Populist Party, culminating ultimately in William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896. And then finally we'll end with about how all this led to the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1914. Now, some of you may be familiar with this book from Ron Paul called End the Fed. It's a popular idea to get rid of the Federal Reserve these days. And what I want to do is link this topic with another current headline. If any of you followed the Republican convention platform writing process, you may have caught note of the fact that the platform included a resolution or language to however the right phrase is, calling for a commission to study whether the United States should go back on a gold standard. Now, this is not a brand new issue for modern Republicans. The 1980 Republican platform called for a commission to study whether to return to the gold standard. And in fact, President Reagan established such a commission, and it all came to nothing. For a variety of reasons, the idea of returning to a gold standard in the early 1980s didn't make any sense. It may or may not make any sense today. But the broader point is, as we go back to that period right after the Civil War, is that the money supply, political management of the money supply, is a perennial issue, and maybe no more severely than ever than between that period after the Civil War, although it's coming back at the moment. Now, one of the things to work backwards is to understand that we're not on the gold standard today, and we haven't been since 1971, or you might say since 1934. We got off the gold standard by degrees in this country. First in 1934, President Roosevelt made it illegal for American citizens to own gold coins. The New Deal actually required that Americans turn in all of their gold to the government. But the federal government, or the United States government, still maintained a gold standard for our international transactions. And we would still redeem our foreign debts in gold if our foreign creditors demanded it. We'll talk about a couple episodes of that. Finally, in 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window, as it was called, and the United States went off the gold standard completely, and now we live in an age of floating currency values. And as I say, we'll talk about that as it goes on. But the gold standard is a bit mysterious. One of the mysteries of the gold standard is put this way by Milton Friedman. There's something odd about digging up gold out of the ground, melting it and casting it into coins and bars, and then burying it back in the ground in the form of bank vaults. In its simplest terms, the reason you have a gold standard or a commodity standard that could include silver is that it imposes some discipline on governments against debasing the currency, right? If you can demand gold instead of more pieces of paper in return for your loan or to exchange your paper for gold, it helps assure that the value of paper money is maintained by the government. Even though at the end of the day, what really assures the value of money is not necessarily a commodity, but it's the underlying or overall productivity of goods and services in an economy. You can have all the gold in the world, but if your factories aren't making anything and if your people aren't growing any food, it's really not worth very much. So gold is really only a surrogate in some ways for the overall wealth and assets that an economy has underneath it. So Milton Friedman always opposed the gold standard. He thought it made no sense to have a gold standard because the supply of gold might not expand as much as the amount of money necessary to keep up with a growing economy. This was the problem in the post-Civil War period, as we shall see. Milton Friedman thought that in the abstract, a central bank can manage the money supply sensibly if it is disciplined. He thought it should follow a fixed rule of expanding the money supply by about 4% a year. And he thought if you did that, you would get consistent, steady economic growth and would smooth out the ups and downs of boom and bust. The history of the Federal Reserve and other central banks is they're never any good at sticking to a consistent rule of monetary growth or contraction, as you need in times of inflation. And so there's a raging argument at the moment, as I referenced in class last week, about whether Milton Friedman would support quantitative easing as is being conducted by the Federal Reserve today. But let me give you a little bit of an illustration to sort of show you the mystery of money and gold and how this all works. So, for example, everyone can pull out of your wallet a $5 bill. Let me zoom in on this so you can really see it up close. This is a $5 bill and what most of our money looks like today. And, you know, it's called across the top here a Federal Reserve note. You know, $5. This is a series 2006, so it's a pretty recent one that we're all used to. Now, if you go back to an older bill that looks like this is one from the, sorry, wrong one. No, this is the right one. This is one from the 1950s. This is a series 1950 $5 bill. So it also says Federal Reserve note. But notice on the bottom here it says, will pay, the fine print is, will pay to the bearer on demand $5. So what does that mean? It means if you walked into the U.S., if you walked into the Treasury Department with this bill and said, I want my $5, the first thing they would do is give you 5 $1 bills. That would say the same thing. We'll pay the bearer on demand $1. So if you said, well, I want my $1, not this piece of green paper, they'd probably give you 4 quarters. In the 1950s, it would have been 4 silver quarters. And, you know, that's what you could do if you thought the silver was worth more than the dollar bill that it was attached to. Now, for a long time, we had even more specific convertible notes. Here's a good one. This is actually a silver certificate, series 1957. And what it says here on the bottom is $1 in silver payable to the bearer on demand. In other words, walk into the U.S. Treasury office or a mint somewhere in the United States, and they would give you either 4 silver quarters. We had silver money up until 1964. Or they would give you $1 worth of raw silver, actually little pellets that they'd measure out for you. You carry it out in a plastic bag or something like that. We abandoned silver convertibility in these silver certificates in 1964, which was the time when we stopped making silver coins. That's one reason why you almost never see, except by accident, any pre-1964 dimes or quarters, because they were made about 90% silver and have a higher value for silver than they do the size of the coin. In other words, there's more than 10 cents worth of silver in a pre-1964 dime, which is why no one would spend dimes anymore when the silver's worth more. Now, let's recapitulate where we have been. The first Bank of the United States, recall, ran from 1791 to about 1811. And then the Second Bank of the United States ran from 1817 to 1836. And prior to the Civil War, the U.S. government was officially on what we might call a bimetal system. In other words, we had a gold and silver standard. The federal government made money in gold coins and silver coins. Mostly, however, silver coins were the main piece of currency that people used. State banks and private banks would issue their own notes, which were really sort of loan certificates. But we didn't have a national paper money currency. In 1834, the government changed the ratio of the gold and silver redemption. This is sort of a technical thing that gets kind of confusing to work out. But between 1834 and the Civil War, gold became the new metal of choice for large denomination coins, at least. Now, what happens in the Civil War is what happens in most total wars: is governments go off the gold standard. They stop redeeming paper money or banknotes for a fixed amount of gold or silver. And to pay for the Civil War, the government did what governments always do. They run the printing press and they borrow lots of money from foreign creditors. And so for the first time in the Civil War, the U.S. government printed paper money in place of gold and silver coins. Greenbacks, they were called. That's where we actually saw our first dollars as we're familiar with today. And the result of running the printing press and borrowing lots of money was predictable. There was very high inflation during the Civil War. The same thing happened in Britain, which went off the gold standard in World War I. France went off the gold standard in one of its wars, the one against Germany, I think, in the 1870s. So one of the things that happened after the Civil War is the government started retiring greenbacks, started paying down the national debt, and there was a lot of sentiment for going back to a gold and silver standard to bring back stability to the currency. Now the question after the Civil War is which metal should we go back to, gold or silver or both? One of the things that was happening after the Civil War is that there was a lot of silver being mined out west. You had the big silver strikes in California and Nevada and other states. And so there was a lot of silver being brought in, and one of the worries was, well, you'll have inflation because there's too much silver being discovered. We'd rather have, the sort of more cautious people thought, better to have just a gold standard rather than a gold and silver standard because we might have a return to wartime style inflation. And so the Coinage Act of 1873 was passed. And what it said was, is the United States shall return to a gold standard by 1879, that was the target date, and we will no longer allow what was called the free coinage of silver. In other words, you couldn't bring your silver in from a mine and have it made into coins and paid in silver-backed banknotes. Now here was the problem with returning to a pure gold standard in the 1870s. The problem was if the supply of gold does not expand sufficiently to match economic output, you'll put downward pressure on the money supply at a time when in fact you need a larger money supply to accommodate economic growth. And so what's happening between the Civil War and, say, the year 1900? Well, you have a lot of extraordinary growth in the American economy. This is when the American economy really industrializes. You know, in 1865, we had a New York Stock Exchange, but there were no major manufacturing companies listed or traded on the New York Stock Exchange. By the year 2000, the United States not only had the largest industrial economy in the world, but it now had dozens and dozens and dozens of major corporations listed on the stock exchange and traded, the way we're familiar with the stock exchange today. Now the problem was, under the gold standard, the money supply couldn't grow fast enough to keep up with this economic expansion. And so what happened was you had a very sharp deflation going on throughout that whole period between the end of the Civil War and really the middle of the 1890s. The average deflation rate, as shown in this chart, was about 1.5% a year. But 1.5% may not sound like much, but it meant that you had consistently falling prices, especially for the agricultural sector, and this caused a huge political problem. Understand that when you have deflation, it favors creditors over debtors. And who are most creditors in this country? Well, it will be banks and financial institutions and rich people. And when you have deflation, it makes the real rate of return on loaned money very, very high. Bankers often do very well in deflationary times. Here I want to pause briefly and make sure everyone understands a basic concept known as the real rate of return. Now, the real rate of return can be explained fairly simply, unlike a lot of these things like exchange rates for currencies and bimetallism. The real rate of return is the interest rate above and beyond the inflation rate. So to give a simple example, if inflation is running 2% a year and you have a loan for 4% a year, you've given a loan for 4% a year, then your real rate of return is the stated interest rate minus the inflation rate. In other words, a 4% interest rate with 2% inflation gives you a 2% real rate of return. Or maybe a better one is if you have a 5% interest rate and 2% inflation, your real rate of return is 3%. You say real rate of return because that means that's the amount on that preserves the purchasing power of the dollar that you've loaned out. And historically, real interest rates, I say historically over a very long term, they tend to be, depending on the length of the loan, anywhere between 1.5% to 2.5% above the inflation rate. Now understand what happens in deflation is if you have loaned, given a loan for 1 year at 2%, but the price level falls by 2%, your real rate of return is 4%. Right? So it's actually above the long-term average of real rates of return. And if you owe money and your income is falling, it is harder and harder to pay back your loans, especially if you've been buying equipment, if you're a farmer, or seeds, or tractors, or farm animals, and so forth. You can see why the deflation of that period between the end of the Civil War and the 1890s was very, very rough on the agricultural communities and rural America and so forth, and why this would lead to a huge political controversy. And then along the way, you have the problem of the usual panics and crashes and severe business cycles that are brought on by this unstable economic environment. So, for example, a very severe depression occurred starting in 1892. 15,000 companies went bankrupt in 1892 and 1893. 491 banks failed. Gross domestic product fell by 12%. I mean, that's a significant drop. And unemployment is estimated to have been as high as 18% by the year 1894. And if you think about this happening at the same time you're seeing large fortunes accumulated by Carnegie, Rockefeller, the so-called trusts, you can see why this would be a political problem. And this brings us to the rise of populism, starting with, I think, the Populist Party in 1892. So I've thrown up here on the screen a few excerpts from the 1892 People's Party platform, or the Populist Party as it was known. And you can see that the great demand of the populists was, we ought to have free coinage of silver again. We ought to go back to a bimetal standard, because if we had silver as well as gold, it will allow for a larger supply of money to be created for the economy. It would stop this deflation that we're having. And you can actually see here in that second paragraph, the specific complaint. Silver, which has been accepted as coin since the dawn of history, has been demonetized to add to the purchasing power of gold by decreasing the value of all forms of property as well as human labor. Here's another longer quotation from the same Populist Party platform in 1892. And you can see that it depicts here a quarter century of struggles between the two great political parties for power and plunder. Although this would refer to the duopoly of Republicans and Democrats, they really have in mind, I think, a second meaning, which is, the banking power or the financial power versus the power of the people. In other words, there's very little that you can see here in the Populist Party platform and later William Jennings Bryan's speech that you aren't seeing all over again in Occupy Wall Street, right? I mean, this language ought to start to be sounding very familiar to us, with the exception of, we're not arguing about gold and silver right now, but we are arguing about that middle passage there about the control of capitalist corporations, national banks, stock market manipulators, and so forth. And so here's some of the demands of the Populist Party. The first one being the most relevant one: the free and unlimited coinage of silver and gold at the present legal ratio of 16:1. And number two, we demand that the amount of circulating medium be speedily increased to not less than $50 per capita. And what they're saying is we need a larger money supply. We need an inflationary monetary policy. And then number three, we demand an income tax. Well, we'll come back to that in our third unit here in another day or so. Number four, we believe that the money of the country should be kept as much as possible in the hands of the people. So, in other words, down with banks. That's really what they're saying. Number five, we demand that postal savings banks be established by the government for the safe deposit of the earnings of the people and to facilitate exchange. Postal savings banks are not something we've ever really had in the United States. We've had some sort of forms of them in savings bonds that you could buy from the government. But the whole point here is we don't want to be putting our savings in private banks that might fail and where we might lose our deposits. Japan, by the way, has a system of postal savings banks, and these are banks where you deposit your money and they don't make loans to mortgages or commercial loans to businesses. They only turn around and buy government securities with it. So they're thought to be pretty safe, but the rate of return is abysmally low, of course. And then finally, let's look at William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech from 1896. I just got a few selections here up on the screen. You can find the whole thing, and it's not that long. I recommend it on the historical documents part of the website. And here you see right in the middle of this first quote about some Democrats. I should pause here and mention that an awful lot of Bryan's speech is not directed as much against Republicans as it is certain members of the Democratic Party. You know, the outgoing Democratic President Grover Cleveland had been a gold man. And there'd been a lot of sentiment amongst Democrats in the Northeast for rejecting the idea of silver and bimetallism. And a lot of the speeches arguing against those parts of his own political party, right? So you can see a split in the Democratic Party about this. One that, by the way, exists today. You have Northeastern Democrats like Senator Schumer of New York, who's very much a defender of Wall Street and the banking sector, against other members of the Democratic Party today, not to mention the Occupy Wall Street people who hate the banks, who hate Wall Street, and so forth. But you can see in the middle of this first paragraph that Bryan is saying that the money question is the paramount issue of the hour. And he's saying that the majority of the Democratic Party is with me, right? And there you see toward the bottom, the free coinage of silver. The believers in the free coinage of silver in the Democratic Party should take control of and control the policy of the Democratic Party. Okay. Now, there is an interesting sentence here that's worth dwelling on for a moment in his speech. They say we are opposing national bank currency. It is true. Now here we should pause and back up a little bit for a moment to the Civil War. So I mentioned that during the Civil War, the government printed greenbacks for the first time, a paper currency not backed up by gold or silver. And greenbacks were actually initially declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court, after a change of personnel, changed its mind a few years later. Be that as it may, the other thing that happened during the Civil War that was significant is that the Congress passed for the first time a national bank charter law. In other words, prior to the Civil War, with the exception of the two banks of the United States, all banks were chartered and regulated on a state-by-state basis, and they still are pretty much today. It was never possible to pass a law allowing for a national bank charter because especially southern states blocked it in Congress. They blocked it in the Senate, of course. But since the South wasn't around during the Civil War to vote in Congress, it was finally possible politically to pass a National Bank Charter Act. Now, national charter banks were pretty simple, but they did have this wrinkle to them. They were required to buy treasury bonds as a condition of getting a national charter. But on the flip side, if they bought treasury bonds, they were allowed to issue their own banknotes up to 90% of their treasury holdings. And this was a way of creating a genuinely national currency for the first time. But not coincidentally, part of the intent of the National Charter Bank Act was to drive state banks out of business. One of the things that was correctly perceived is that these state banks, they fail a lot because they're not disciplined, they create too much credit. They're a large part of the reason why business cycles can be so violent in this country, why you'd have panics and crashes that would reverberate out and cause very sharp depressions every decade or so, it seemed like. And the thought was if you had national banks that were required to participate in the treasury bond market, you would have a more stable monetary policy. That was the thought behind it. Well, it didn't really work. I mean, state banks remained very politically popular, and so you still had the problem of state banks contributing to the economic instability of the country during the post-Civil War era. And so there's Bryan saying, they say we are opposing national bank currency. It is true. Bryan was clearly on the side of small banks to the extent he liked banks at all and wanted to keep it out of the hands of the federal government. And so he goes on to say in that speech the following, which I think is interesting. If you will read what Thomas Benton said, you will find he said that in searching history, he could find but one parallel to Andrew Jackson. That was Cicero, who destroyed the conspiracy of Catiline and saved Rome. Benton said that Cicero only did for Rome what Jackson did for us when he destroyed the bank conspiracy and saved America. We say in our platform that we believe that the right to coin and issue money is a function of government. We believe it. We believe that it is a part of sovereignty and can no more with safety be delegated to private individuals than we could afford to delegate to private individuals the power to make penal statutes or levy taxes. This is a somewhat incoherent passage, economically speaking, because on the one hand, he says he wants the government to be taking charge of regulating the value of money, like it says in the Constitution. And he's saying that we don't want to delegate to private individuals, he means banks, the power to affect all this. On the other hand, the idea of the free coinage of silver, meaning if you bring in a bunch of silver you've dug up out of the ground, you'll be paid for it, is actually delegating to private individuals what might happen. So this isn't quite coherent, but you can see the politics behind it. He's against the bankers, and especially large national banks. He's against New York, you might say. And he makes that clear, I think, in the next paragraph where he talks about Thomas Jefferson and culminating with the statement here at the end that banks ought to go out of the governing business. Let's have banks out of government. Again, this sounds pretty much like what you might see on an Occupy Wall Street sign today. And then finally, just because I wouldn't want to leave it behind, we have the famous ending to that great peroration about you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. But the sentences right before it make clear that he sees this politically as a conflict between the commercial interests against the workers, capital versus labor. This is not that much different from the way it was explained by Thomas Jefferson almost 100 years before, and not that much different from what we're hearing today from Occupy Wall Street. But also, to a certain extent, you hear some accents of this from the Tea Party, right? It's not clear to me who distrusts the Federal Reserve more, the Tea Party or the Occupy Wall Street folks, or who dislikes banks and bank bailouts more, Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party. Well, everyone knows how the election of 1896 turned out. William McKinley beat William Jennings Bryan handily. And the issue between free coinage of silver and the whole bimetallism debate faded very rapidly for the simplest of reasons. And it brings us back again to the serendipitous role of technology. Starting in the 1890s, you had a whole new process for producing gold, and it was known as the cyanide process. And so suddenly, out of mines in the United States, but especially in South Africa, you had large amounts of gold coming into the world market. And so the problem of the gold supply not keeping up with the need for an expansion of the money supply went away very rapidly. The Great Deflation that had gone on between the end of the Civil War and the 1890s suddenly stopped and reversed. And the U.S. price level went up by 44% between 1896 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Well, even though the deflationary problem of the post-Civil War era had been largely resolved by the end of the 1890s because of the large discoveries of gold around the world, there remained the problem of the business cycle. And the panic of 1907, which is the last episode we'll want to consider here for this segment, brought matters to a head. Now, the Panic of 1907 was a classic run on the banks. But the underlying problem was not entirely clear. It wasn't like a crop failure or a war or some other proximate economic cause. There are some signs that there were liquidity problems in the financial sector creeping up for months. The stock market had been declining. The cost of credit had been rising. So there were some signs of instability, but nothing that necessarily would touch off a full-scale panic and bank run. But what happened was that when depositors want their money back from one bank, it often spreads to other banks. And that's exactly what happened in the Panic of 1907. In October of that year, one of the larger trust companies, the Knickerbocker Trust, failed quite suddenly. A lot of their business had been extending credit to the stock market, where people were using large loans to buy stocks on margin. By the way, margin for stock is a little bit like a mortgage. Traditionally, to buy a house, you need a 20% down payment and you borrow 80%. One of the reasons for the housing crisis is we relaxed that capital requirement, and some people were getting houses for 3% down on the total cost and borrowing for 97% of the value. In some cases, people were buying houses for no money down. Well, no wonder this thing went badly. Well, in 1907, the margin requirement, or you might say the mortgage requirement to buy stocks, was 10%. In other words, you only needed $1 to buy $10 worth of stock on the exchange. Well, if the value of that stock falls, or if your interest rate goes up for what you're borrowing, you can see that there's a huge potential for a huge credit problem. So when the Knickerbocker Trust failed in early October of 1907, the fear was of contagion. That's the phrase you hear out of Europe today, right? Is that if Greece goes down, the contagion will spread to other weak countries like Spain and Portugal and Italy and Ireland and so forth. What you had happen was people lining up around the block in New York at various banks saying, I want my savings back. I want it in cash, please. Banks don't keep enough cash on hand to redeem all those people. And so there was the panic that the whole financial sector might collapse, or large parts of it. And because so much of this credit was going into the stock market was about to crash. And there was a sense that the stock market might have to close. And in fact, on Thursday, October 24th, the head of the stock market walked across the street to the most famous banker of his time, that being J. Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan, as you know, the bank today, and said, I'm afraid I might have to close the stock market. Well, now, Morgan was the Warren Buffett of his day, by far and away the most consequential tycoon of the time, much more important than Rockefeller or Carnegie or any of the other so-called robber barons of the time. And he was quite concerned that closing the stock market could lead to a major catastrophe that would spread across the country. And so the first thing he did was round up 5 other solvent bankers who were his friends. Together they pledged $27 million on the spot to keep the stock market open. And overnight, Morgan rounded up more bankers, and together they all pooled in enough money to keep the banking system afloat and to avert a wider crisis over the next several days. The other thing Morgan did the next morning on Friday was send around letters and call up clergymen in New York, asking them to give encouraging sermons on Sunday to help restore public confidence. Well, things did calm down over the next few weeks, and Morgan was hailed as a hero, even by President Theodore Roosevelt, who had only weeks before been attacking the malefactors of great wealth, as he called them. But in the aftermath of the panic of 1907, there was a general sense that the banking system couldn't go on depending on someone like J.P. Morgan to bail them out in times of trouble. After all, Morgan was over 70 years old at the time. And so the support grew for reviving a national bank, or because economic knowledge had progressed, the idea of a central bank, that being the Federal Reserve as we know it today. The Federal Reserve Act finally passed in 1913 to set up the bank the following year. And the 2 most salient features of the original Federal Reserve was that banks could become members or subscribers to the Federal Reserve by committing 6% of their capital, or depositing 6% of their capital with the Federal Reserve Bank. In return for which, second, the Federal Reserve would step in with liquidity for those banks in times of crisis, and it also would regulate member banks to assure their solvency. The Federal Reserve could also make loans to its member banks. So in other words, the Federal Reserve became, you might say, the bank of banks, as well as something of a reinsurance organization for banks. It wasn't until the 1930s that the Federal Reserve added to it what we now know as the open market operations. That means the Federal Reserve going in and buying and selling securities on its own account to affect the money supply and to inject liquidity into banks directly. It's through the open market operations that the Federal Reserve conducts the various quantitative easings that we've discussed in class. That came somewhat later. And so we'll conclude with this thought. While Milton Friedman supports the idea of central banking in principle, though not always in practice, as we shall see, he's been a harsh critic of the practices of the Federal Reserve on a number of occasions. There are a lot of other conservative economists, especially from the Austrian school, like von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who think central banking is a bad idea, that central bankers will always get it wrong, will always make mistakes in the money supply and end up destabilizing the economy or making booms and busts worse. because of what Hayek called the knowledge problem. This is something we'll talk about in class in a few more weeks as we get to the Great Depression and the post-war era. But for the time being, one of the questions we will want to evaluate by the end of this course, at the end of the semester, is the extent to which bad judgments or bad decisions and policies of the Federal Reserve actually contributed to or even caused the housing crisis and crash of 2008. Depending on how you judge that question, it will judge whether the Austrians are ultimately correct and whether the advocates of a gold standard have a better argument about this, or whether Milton Friedman's ideas about fiat money are right. And there's a lot to untangle there, but we will get to that in due course. So that's it for now, but I'll be back shortly with some more thoughts on a different subject.